finish off Revelation chapter 16 this evening, and it will also be one of our special weeks. So, as you know, we've been going through the book of Revelation. We've been setting aside some special weeks, some special one-off weeks, just to cover any major themes or any major talking points, things surrounding end times that people often have. We set aside a week to look at the concept of the Antichrist a few months ago. We looked at things like the dating of the book of Revelation. So today will be one of those special weeks. But before we get to that, we're going to finish off our examination of Revelation 16, which is the 7 bowls. You will remember from a couple of weeks ago, we were going through chapter 16 and we're looking at the pouring out of the 7 bowls of wrath. We've got to just finish with the 7th bowl of wrath. And then what we'll do is we'll go into our special week, which will be looking at Jesus's teaching on the end times. So if you're tuning in today and you want to hear about what Jesus had to say about the end times, just hold yourself for a few minutes, because we will get to that. My plan is to finish the 7th bowl pretty quickly, and then we'll get to it. But just to give ourselves a summation of where we have been, we're in what I've called the 7th scene of the book of Revelation, and we've titled this scene the 7 bowls, and it covers us in chapters 15 and 16. And really what is being poured out here is the judgment of God as it has been predicted already. So we know that God's Old Testament, his Old Covenant people have committed adultery. They have prostituted themselves away from the true and the living God, and they have rejected the Messiah. And Jesus predicted that there would be consequences and calamities for Israel's rejection. And this would take place about 40 odd years after his life, when the temple would be destroyed and the people of God would be exiled into a diaspora. And out of this judgment come a new covenant people, a covenant people built upon the death and resurrection of Jesus, the new covenant church. And that's what we've been exploring throughout the book of Revelation. And we mentioned that the bowls of wrath represent, they are the image that would have been most familiar to John's audience were the priestly vessels, the utensils used by the priests in their temple sacrifices. When they would sacrifice an animal, they would the blood would be captured in these vessels, in these bowls, and then they would be poured out onto the altar. So the 7 bowls of wrath correspond to the bowls used by the priest. And we've reflected on this point that the 7 bowls remind us the judgments sort of communicated, the language of the judgment that's communicated is that plague-like language, which reminds the audience of the Exodus narrative, that just like God created his people, he liberated his people in the Old Testament times through a series of plagues that were thrust upon the nation of Egypt. Now we have a liberation of God's people, the New Testament people. They're being liberated. The gospel message is going out, and judgment is part of that gospel message and the way that the gospel message goes out. And we remembered that earlier in the year when we looked at the 7 seals, the Lamb who was holding the scroll with the 7 seals, and he opened the scrolls. He was worthy to open the seals. We noticed that we recognized that was the announcement of God's judgment. When we looked last term at the 7 trumpets, and we looked at the plague-like judgment language that was featured there, we recognized that was the assembling of God's judgment, just like members of the army would blow a trumpet to say, now the battle is about to begin. And in the 7 bowls, we have the execution of God's judgment. So we have the announcement that God's judgment is coming. We have the assembling of God's judgment. Now is the time, the book of Revelation says. And now in chapter 16, we see judgment is executed. The announcement, the assembling, the execution. That's what we've been focusing on right the way through. And we've asked ourselves, why does the book of Revelation keep on repeating itself? It uses that 7 imagery over and over again. 7 seals to communicate judgment. 7 trumpets to communicate judgment. Now 7 bowls. It's because the judgment and wrath of God is perfect. the judgment of wrath of God is completely righteous. It is completely justifiable. And as when we looked at our examination of the seals and the trumpets, we recognized that God's judgment would manifest itself. It would look like things like conquest. There was going to be war and bloodshed, famine and pestilence, disease. There was going to be political chaos. We recognized that all of these things were going to be thrust upon the land of Israel, the land of Judea, and upon the temple. And it would culminate in 70 AD, when the forces led by Titus, the mercenary army, would come in and sack the city and destroy the temple. And there would be the collapse of the religious institution, the collapse of the traditional religious groups in Jerusalem. Things like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the high priest, these officers would completely collapse. And this is all part of God's plan. And through this judgment, the gospel would go out. So that's what we've been looking at. And that's all a refresher. And if you need to, you can go back and you can look at the episodes that correspond to what we've looked at already. And we looked at the concept of Armageddon last time. And you can go back and you can review all of that. But today we're going to finish it off with the seventh bowl. And I've titled this bowl, Wrath Complete. Wrath Complete. So the wrath of God which is poured out, the wrath of God which manifests itself through military invasion, political chaos, spiritual bankruptcy, death in the land, disease, all of these things is now going to be complete. And it was complete in 70 AD. But before we get to that, just are there any questions or any comments people want to make based on the summary that I have given? Excellent. So could somebody read for us, please, the culminating verses of chapter 16, which we'll go from verse 17. We finished off with verse 16 last time, 2 weeks ago when we met. Could someone please read for us verses 17 to the end of chapter 16?
I can do that.
Thanks.
The seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and out of the temple came a loud voice from the throne, saying, "It is done." Then there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a severe earthquake. No earthquake like it has ever occurred since mankind has been on earth. So tremendous was the quake. The great city split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. Every island fled away, and the mountains could not be found. From the sky, huge hailstones, each weighing about 100 pounds, fell on earth, and they cursed God on account of the plague of hail, because the plague was so terrible.
So the seventh bowl is going to be poured out, the seventh bowl of God's wrath. And we've titled this section, this bowl, Wrath Complete. Wrath Complete. So how do we get to this point? Well, verse 17. The seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and out of the temple came a loud voice from the throne saying, "It is done." So once again, we find ourselves entering into the throne room of God, as we did in chapters 4 and 5, where we went into the very throne room of God. And we can see that the seventh angel, the seventh messenger, is commanded to pour out the bowl. And this very instruction, this very command is coming from the throne of God. And it is from this voice that we hear the expression, "It is done." It is done. Now, this reminds us almost of the seventh trumpet. And I mentioned before that these themes repeat themselves. We're not really running into any difficulties unpacking the 7 bowls of wrath, because they're not touching on themes that we haven't already covered at some point in the book of Revelation. And we notice in chapter 11, verse 15, when the 7th trumpet is blown, it says the 7th angel sounded his trumpet, and loud voices called out of heaven, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever." So now we see that out of this judgment, the kingdom of Christ is reigning. The kingdom of Christ will reign forever and ever. So it's a reminder to God's audience here, as they're hearing the words of the book of Revelation, is that the wrath of God, the judgment of God, is part of the reigning and the ruling of Jesus. The rule of Jesus, the reign of Christ, comes about through judgment. The judgment that was poured out upon Christ for our behalf at the cross, when for our sins he was pierced. That is the reign of God made possible. So the 7 bowls of wrath, as God's judgment is being executed, the temptation can be to sit back and think, why is such calamity coming upon the nation of Israel? Why is such calamity coming upon the temple? Why is the temple and the institution being destroyed? Why is it that the sacrificial system is being overturned? And what the book of Revelation is reminding us is that this is the reign of Christ. This is the rule of Christ. And the destruction of the temple in AD 70 completed the wrath of God being poured out in the first century. And remarkably, the destruction of the temple in AD 70 was further evidence of Jesus's claim to divinity. It's further proof to the first century world that Jesus was who he claimed to be. He was divine in nature. He held the divine attribute of omniscience. We know that God is omniscient. What does that mean, that God is omniscient? It means that God is all-knowing. He knows the past, he knows the present, and he knows the future. There is nothing that God does not know. There is nothing beyond God's knowledge. God is omniscient. And Jesus had demonstrated this multiple times in the Gospels when he predicted the future ahead of time. He predicted his death and his resurrection. He said to his disciples ahead of time that he was going to be crucified. The Son of Man will go up to Jerusalem, he said, and he will be handed over, and he will be flogged, and he will be crucified, but he will be raised on the third day. Jesus had predicted the destruction of the temple. What did he say in Matthew 24 when he predicted the destruction of the temple? He said, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all of these things have happened." Now, there is a major exegetical mistake that many people make when they read Matthew 24. And we discussed this last year when we looked at the Olivet Discourse, and we looked at the sermon Jesus gave, when Jesus was asked by his disciples, when they marveled at these buildings, and Jesus predicted that this was going to be within a generation, not one stone was going to be left on another. And his disciples were confused, and they said, when is this going to happen? When are you going to, what are going to be the signs of your return? And he gave a whole list of things. Nation will rise against nation. You will be persecuted. There will be wars. There will be rumors of wars. And people think that these are things yet to come. But Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until these things have happened." And what was a biblical generation? A biblical generation was 40 years. So the book of Revelation is talking about things which Jesus has predicted. It is expanding upon that famous sermon Jesus gave. So although, yes, there are things in the book of Revelation which are still to come, there are things which are still to come. The inauguration of the new heavens and the new earth is still to come. But at least we can say that there's a lion's share of things that the book of Revelation predicts which took place in the first century. And I've been consistent, brothers and sisters, in my approach to the book of Revelation. I haven't chopped and changed. I've maintained one consistent pattern right the way through. But what did Jesus say at his trial when they were interrogating Jesus? And they said, "Tell us if you are the Son of the Blessed One." And what did Jesus say? He said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." And remember, when he makes that statement, what does the high priest do? He tears his garment and he says, "You have heard the blasphemy from his mouth himself." In other words, you have heard this man now in your ears claim that he is God and what he will come on the clouds of heaven. What were the clouds of heaven? The clouds of heaven were judgment. That was judgment language. When it talked about God in the Old Testament riding on the clouds, it was judgment language. And what was Jesus saying? You will know that I am who I claim to be when you see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. And what was 70 AD? 70 AD was the Son of Man coming on the clouds in judgment. Jesus said in that famous sermon, They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until what? Until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. What was he saying? He was saying, out of this judgment on Jerusalem, out of this judgment, the old ways of doing things will be overturned. And in its place, what will come? The old temple system will be judged and will be overturned, never to be restored again. And in its place, what will come? The new temple. The new temple, which is what Jesus says? It's me, Jesus says. I am the temple. Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days, Jesus says. Now, that is the time of the Gentiles, brothers and sisters. We are living in the time of the Gentiles. Jesus said in this sermon that this gospel will be preached unto the ends of the earth. And it's after this gospel is preached to the ends of this earth and Gentiles are brought into the temple, brought into the kingdom, what will happen, Jesus says? Well, Jesus said after that, now about that day or the hour, no one knows. So we see that the seventh bowl is the completion of God's wrath. He has poured out his wrath on Jerusalem, on his people, and that wrath is now complete. That wrath was completed in the first century. Now is the time for the Gentiles and the gospel to be expanded. And yes, there will come a day when judgment will come, and those who have rejected Jesus will be thrown into the lake of fire. That is to come. But in the first century, the bowls of wrath are poured out, and God's wrath is completed on what was the old institution to pave way for the new era of God's people and the advancement of the gospel message. It's a message in which Jews and Gentiles can come into the temple of God, not by ethnicity as it was in the Old Testament, but now they can come through the blood that was shed at the cross through Jesus Christ, the Messiah. Any questions or comments there, as everyone's with me at this particular point? Now, what I've been saying would be controversial to many people who have not understood the book of Revelation through these lenses. But you can see that we have followed that same consistent pattern all the way through. But let's continue now with verse 18. Then there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a severe earthquake. No earthquake like it has ever occurred since mankind has been on earth. So tremendous was the quake. Now, again, we're in the book of Revelation. It's important to remind ourselves that the genre of the book of Revelation is apocalyptic literature. It borrows a lot of poetic images and metaphors, this explosive language. You remember at the start when we spent time examining the genre of the book of Revelation, we said that this is poetry. This is a unique genre in the world. It's not a genre that we're familiar with today. But it's like a movie. If we're looking at a Hollywood blockbuster, we step into the genre, the universe in which the genre is self-contained in order to appreciate what's going on. In a Hollywood blockbuster, when we see explosions and the like, we don't step outside and think, oh my goodness, these things are happening in real life. We don't expect to, when we see a Hollywood blockbuster, when it takes place in America or whatever, we don't stop and think, oh my goodness, tomorrow in the newspapers there's going to be articles about America on fire or all of these sorts of things. No, we appreciate the genre when we step into my favorite franchise, the 007, the James Bond franchise, and we see that code 007. We know that is a symbolic code. And that's the same in the book of Revelation. When we step into the apocalyptic genre, we appreciate the imagery and the metaphor and the symbolism in the self-contained apocalyptic language. And we know that the book of Revelation, the key, the legend, if you will, to unlocking the book of Revelation is the Old Testament. We see how these vivid signs and imagery is used in the Old Testament prophetic and poetic language. So we look at how these things are used in, for instance, the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Malachi, and the like. We look at how this language is used. And we also look at how it's used in the Psalms and in the poetry of the Old Testament. And what happened when we hear this language of lightning and earthquakes? And we've heard this language already in the book of Revelation. In fact, this earthquake-style language appears 7 times in the book of Revelation. It's part of that 7-cycle imagery of the book of Revelation. And this is the 7th occasion it appears. Well, it takes us back to a very real image. And that is the image of the Exodus, when the nation of Israel gathered before God at Mount Sinai. What could they see? They could see very real demonstrations of the presence of God. The presence of God was the presence of God corresponded to nature responding to the presence of its creator. The Bible says that heaven and earth flee from Jesus, that the very presence of God, the manifested glory of God, when it comes onto this earth, creation responds. When Jesus was born, there was what? There was a response in the heavenly realms. What happened? There was a sign appeared in the sky. A star appeared in the sky. The heavenly bodies shook when the angels sung his praises. So at Mount Sinai, when the people of God gathered, there was lightning, there was rumbles, there was peals of thunder. The earth shook violently. And it was this very realistic response of creation that in the poetic language of the Old Testament became a symbol to describe God's presence and the very throne room of God shaking with the commands of God. We saw this in verse 5 of chapter 4 when we entered the throne room of God. So majestic is the Creator that from the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder. The book of Exodus says when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet, they saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance. So what the book of Revelation is reminding us now is that the very judgment of God is earth-shattering. It is the manifest presence of God is coming in his judgment, and earth should fear and stand in awe of the majesty of its creator. And any questions or comments there? So we pick up with verse 18 here. Continuing on with verse 18. My apologies there. Continuing with verse 18. So, of course, earthquakes and lightning they're literal phenomena. And they're literal things that happened. At Mount Sinai, there was a literal lightning and earthquakes. But as I was mentioning, in the poetic language of the Old Testament, they took this natural phenomenon and it stood for the dramatic shaking in a metaphorical sense of the realities, both heavenly and earthly. So when the book of Revelation talks about there being earthquakes and lightning, it is talking about its poetic language to communicate the shaking of earthly bodies which took place at the judgment in 70 AD. So it was saying that the judgment of God, when he poured out his wrath on his old covenant people, when he poured out his wrath on Jerusalem, there was a shaking of earthly and heavenly realities. You see, what had happened before this? The old covenant people of God were in relationship with God. They kept the commands of God through what? Through the sacrificial system. They came into the presence of God when they came into the temple in Jerusalem. And what was happening in 70 AD through the pouring out of God's wrath? He was shaking the very foundations of how people had come into the presence of God. He was shaking and he was destroying. He was splitting apart the mountain where people would come in order to be in fellowship with God. So this poetic language is talking about the cataclysmic shaking of realities which happened when God judged Jerusalem. And in its place, he brought about his new covenant people. So we can see this metaphorical language is used to communicate the intensity and the power of what happened in the first century. This is not minor judgment, brothers and sisters. This is a major overturning of spiritual realities where people once thought you could come into covenant relationship with God through the ordinances of the Day of Atonement, through the Passover lamb. God has shook that. The high priest is no longer the spiritual leader of God's people. It is now the Messiah. Jerusalem is no longer the place to go if you want to encounter God, if you want to step into the presence of God. No, God has shaken the very heavens and he's bringing about a new creation. Any questions or comments, or is this making sense to everyone? Now, the Old Testament framework, the prophetic framework, if we're looking for some sort of prediction of this happening, occurs in the story of Haggai, in Haggai chapter 2. Bit of context is helpful for us here. We know in the first century, after centuries and centuries, we know in the Old Testament, after centuries and centuries of rebellion, God spoke about how he was going to judge his people. Jeremiah predicts it. Isaiah predicts it. They talk about the fact that the people of God, because of their adultery, because of their worship of foreign and pagan gods, because of their rejection of Yahweh, judgment is coming. And it took place first when the northern tribes were exiled in 720 years before Jesus. But then in 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar marches his army into Jerusalem, and he sacks the city, and he burns the first temple to a crisp, the temple that King Solomon had built. He burns it to a crisp. But this judgment, God says, is not an eternal judgment. For he talks about how even after this judgment, he's going to bring the people of God back. The exile will last only 70 years, and then he will bring the people back. If you read the Old Testament, you study the Old Testament, this is part of the history of the Old Testament. He's going to bring the people back. And that is exactly what he does. In 539 BC, 70 years after the first exile begins, he brings a wave of his people back. If we read in the book of Daniel, we notice that Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon, and he gives an edict that the people of God can go back to the promised land and rebuild their lives, rebuild their city, rebuild their walls. This is what books like Ezra, this is what books like Nehemiah, they're all about, the rebuild that happens. But the people of God get a bit sluggish, and they get a bit apathetic in their rebuild. You see, instead of committing their lives to rebuilding the temple of God, they commit their lives to rebuilding their own lives. Sounds a bit like modern Christianity sometimes. Instead of committing ourselves to expanding the kingdom of God, we commit our lives to our own kingdoms and building our own wealth and our own portfolios. So one of the prophets that God sends to the people at this time is the prophet Haggai. And the prophet Haggai, along with the prophet Zechariah, encourages the people to be strong and to rebuild the temple. And he says that the glory of this temple, the second temple, is going to exceed the glory of the former temple. And in Haggai 2, he says, this is what the Lord Almighty says, in a little while I will come once more and shake the heavens and the earth, the sea, and the dry land. I will shake all nations, and what is desired by all nations will come. And I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord Almighty. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, declares the Lord Almighty. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And in this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty. So what was Haggai predicting? Haggai was predicting the time of Christ, the time of the Messiah, when Jesus himself was going to come, and he was going to do what? He was going to shake the foundations of the temple and overturn the temple and the glory. What made the temple glorious? It was the fact that God's Spirit resided in the Holy of Holies. So what was Jesus saying? What was Haggai predicting? Haggai was predicting a day when the glory of the former temple would be far exceeded. And what does the New Testament say this day is? The New Testament says that this is the coming of the Holy Spirit. That the Holy Spirit's coming, and the Holy Spirit now, instead of living in a building, the Holy Spirit lives inside the hearts of every single believer. This is what Hebrews says in Hebrews 12. At that time, his voice shook the earth. But now he has promised, once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. So what the book of Revelation is talking about is that in the pouring out of God's wrath, he is shaking the heavens, as he predicted during the time of the prophet Haggai. And now the Holy Spirit has come upon his believers. And in verse 19, it says that the great city split into three parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. So again, we come about this image of Babylon. And I won't spend too much time dwelling on this because we've already covered this. But when we looked at chapter 14, we established the premise, the very important premise, that the great city and Babylon are references in the New Testament to Jerusalem. Now, yes, Babylon was a real empire in the Old Testament. It's where the Tower of Babel was used. Yes, Babylon was a real place. It was the place, the Babylonian Empire was Nebuchadnezzar's empire, which invaded the temple in the Old Testament times. But we recognize that Babylon collapsed. The Babylonian Empire collapsed. Never again was it rebuilt. And in fact, some of the same poetic language that is used by the prophet Isaiah and Jeremiah to describe the fall of Babylon, it is used now in the New Testament to describe this new Babylon. Because Babylon didn't exist in Jesus' day. It was a relic. It was an empire which ceased to exist. It's like the Vikings. The Vikings don't exist anymore, right? Now we have a new Babylon. And this new Babylon is described as what? The great city. Now, the book of Revelation doesn't leave us in any dispute as to who this Babylon, who this great city is. Now, people have made this point controversial. They think, oh, Babylon is some sort of kingdom that is to come. You know, when Saddam Hussein was building his power in Iraq, because ancient Babylon was in Iraq, modern day Iraq, people thought, this is fulfillment of biblical prophecy. But they miss a very important exegetical point, that this Babylon, this great city in the book of Revelation, it leaves us in no doubt who this great city is. And we established this point in chapter 14. Because notice what it says. It says, their bodies will lie in the public square, in Revelation 11:8. Their bodies will lie in the public square of the great city, which is figuratively, so it's a metaphor, figuratively called Sodom and Egypt. But what does it say? Where also their Lord was crucified. Now, brothers and sisters, where was Jesus crucified? Jerusalem. So, ipso facto, if the great city is Jerusalem, and here Babylon the Great is referred to as the great city, ipso facto, what are we talking about? We're talking about Jerusalem. Babylon is a code name for Jerusalem in the book of Revelation. This should be uncontroversial. There's only one great city where Jesus was crucified, and that is Jerusalem. So what we're seeing here, when that language of Babylon, that code name Babylon is used, what is it saying? It's saying that which city in the Old Testament was regarded as the antithesis to the people of God? Which city in the Old Testament was so evil? Which city was it? Well, it was Babylon. That was Sin City. That was the most that was, if you were to ask people in the Old Testament, what is the one city which stands against everything of God? They would have said Babylon. What the book of Revelation is saying is that has become Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the new Babylon. Why? Because they have rejected Jesus. We have no king but Caesar, they said. They have rejected their God, and they have committed adultery. There's only one city, one people group who's in covenant relationship with God, and that's who? That is the nation of Israel. Rome is not in covenant relationship with God. How can Rome commit adultery? They're not in covenant relationship with God. Who's in covenant relationship with God? Well, it's Jerusalem, it's Israel. Read Ezekiel 16. Ezekiel 16 talks about a harlot who has prostituted itself, and instead of worshipping the Lord, this harlot has turned and worshipped the God of the nations. It has drunk, and it has gotten drunk in a metaphorical sense through the gods of the nations. And in the Old Testament, God poured out his wrath once on Jerusalem when he destroyed it in 586 BC. But this time, this wrath, unlike the first exile, this wrath will not be overturned. It is complete. It is filled. And we see this language of the pouring out of God's wrath in Isaiah 51, where he says, "Awake, awake, rise up, Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath." The cup of his wrath, which was poured out in the Old Testament. God brought his people back. But what do we read here in the book of Revelation? We see that the wrath is complete. God will never again restore Jerusalem to the heights. That's why I keep saying, brothers and sisters, people that believe that there's going to be a third temple built and this is going to inaugurate the second coming of Jesus, it's rubbish. The third temple is being rebuilt. And what is it? It is us. We are the third temple. The temple is no longer a building, it's a people group. What does the Old Testament say? I will take out this heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. Any questions or comments there? So it says that this great city collapses and it's split in three. What does it mean that it's split in three? Well, there's a couple of possibilities as to what could be going on here, a couple of possible interpretations. The interesting thing about Jerusalem at this time is Jerusalem internally there was turmoil internally. And there's two possibilities here. I believe that the reference to the city being split into three is a reference to the internal turmoil which beset the city at this particular point in time. Now, there's two possibilities as to what this could be referring to. So internally, Jerusalem at this time had some competing factions trying to jockey for power. There was the zealots. You remember in the Gospels that Judas Iscariot is described as a zealot. The zealots were a particular faction. Consider them like a paramilitary type group. They were kind of like a paramilitary group which tried to recruit volunteers, and they wanted to overthrow Rome, and they wanted to overthrow Rome through violence and bloodshed. And in the early days of the Jewish revolt, this is exactly what the zealots did. They amassed an army together and they went after Rome, and they had early successes, which made them think that God was with them, that God was liberating them. And as Jesus predicted, many false messiahs came up at this time thinking that they proclaimed the message that, Jerusalem was going to be liberated. What did Jesus say? He said, be careful of the false messiahs that will give these false promises. So many people rallied to the zealots here. They were one faction competing for power. You also had the moderates in Jerusalem. There were moderates in Jerusalem who sort of were sitting back and thinking, we can't challenge the might of Rome. We need to sort of pull back here and come to some sort of broker, some sort of peace deal with Rome. So they were the moderates who were also competing for power. And then there was the ruling elite at this time, the priestly caste, like the high priest office and the like. That they were all over the shop. Some of them were trying to figure out ways of trying to stay loyal and trying to broker a peace deal with Rome because the very power which they had amassed under Rome was at threat. Some of them were thinking, well, maybe we should get out of the Rome's powers here. So there were these three factions which were competing for power and jockeying for power, which made the situation worse. And the zealots at this time, in order to try to force the hand of the people and try to unify people, burnt the grain supply. Jerusalem could have avoided a siege. They could have lasted 5 years. They had enough food. They had water supply and everything. They could have lasted for 5 years. And in fact, many commentators and many war scholars have argued that Jerusalem could have actually won. Rome itself, when Nero committed suicide, was in internal turmoil. So Israel could have capitalized on this internal turmoil. That when Titus came, he had a mercenary army. And you can imagine with Rome experiencing internal turmoil, what happens when there's internal turmoil? There's turmoil on your foreign policy. Nations who you were oppressing try to get out from under your thumb. So Jerusalem could have survived and they may have even won the war. But because of all the internal factions competing, it's hard to keep an army fed. Jerusalem is surrounded by desert. It's hard to keep your army fed. So Titus would have had a real difficult time of winning this war had there not have been internal factions within Jerusalem eating itself from within. And if you remember earlier on in the book of Revelation, we talked about some of the problems that was going to beset Jerusalem. One of the things we mentioned was that there was actually going to be internal turmoil, which was almost like a virus from within, eating Israel and the people of God up from within. So this is what I mean by, and what I think the book of Revelation means when it says that the great city was split into three. But there's a second possibility, that even within the zealot factions, there were internal turmoils. There were at least three different zealot groups competing for power. You had one group which was led by a man by the name of Eleazar ben Simon. There was another group led by a man called John of Gischala. Then there was one that was led by a man by the name of Simon ben Georias. So all of these different zealot groups were competing for power because they believed that if they won the day, they would have what? They would be installed as king, and they would become in the line of David, and they would become what? They would become the Messiah. So there were all of these factions competing for power, and they tried to harmonize. They tried to see Rome as the common enemy, but their unity couldn't last long, and it was for this reason that Rome was able to win in just 5 months once Titus and his forces got down there. So when it talks about the great city being split into what? The great city is what? The great city is Jerusalem. That's uncontroversial. We're told that the great city is the place where the Lord was crucified. When it talks about the great city being split into three, what does it mean? It means that there were competing factions jockeying for power. And this aided Rome in its quest to destroy Jerusalem. Any questions or comments there? Does that make sense? Okay, so let's finish off these two verses pretty quickly. So verse 20, every island fled away and the mountains could not be found. So again, I just want to cover this really quickly. This sort of language of the islands fleeing, the mountains not being found, this is just prophetic and poetic symbolism of the Old Testament. This sort of language conjures up that image of dramatic shifts in political and earthly principalities. This sort of God's judgment is shaking the very foundations. And obviously we know that the land was given to the nation of Israel as God's gift. So when it uses this poetic language of islands and mountains being shaken, it's that reference to judgment, the severity of God's judgment. There's some references there from Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and also earlier in the book of Revelation, which covers this particular point. But just quickly moving on to verse 21. From the sky, huge hailstones, each weighing 100 pounds, or in metric system, it would be 45 kilograms, fell on the people, and they cursed God on account of the terrible hail, because the plague was so terrible. So this language of hailstones falling, this reminds us of what? It reminds us of the seventh plague during the time of the Exodus. When what was the seventh plague? The seventh plague was the plague of hail, the hailstones which fell from heaven as judgment upon Egypt. In Exodus 9, it says, then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky, so that hail will fall over Egypt, on people and animals, and on everything growing in the fields of Egypt. When Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, the Lord sent thunder and hail, and lightning flashed down on the ground. So the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. Hail fell and lightning flashed back and forth. It was the worst storm in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Throughout Egypt, hail struck everything in the fields, both people and animals. It beat down everything growing in the fields and stripped away every tree. The only place it did not hail was in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. And then it goes on to say, so Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had said through Moses. So what do we see happening? What do we see happening here? Well, we see this very clever allusion to the book of Exodus and the seventh plague, that the judgment of God fell where? It fell on Egypt, but it didn't fall where the people of God were. And what the book of Revelation is saying here is it's taking this image, this metaphor of hailstones, and it's saying it's falling on who? It's falling on those who are in rebellion to God, but the judgment is not falling on the people of God. Just like it didn't fall on the people of God in the Exodus, it doesn't fall on the people of God now in the New Testament. Why? Because God's people have done what? Well, God said to his people when he predicted the fall of Jerusalem in Matthew 24, he said what? When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you know what? It's time for the time for its desolation is near. So what do? You get out. So the people of God are not falling under the judgment of God because they have heeded the warnings of Christ. And just like we've been saying right throughout our study of the book of Revelation, many of the clever illustrations and the symbolisms were things that the Old Testament took. It was language that the Old Testament took, and the prophets applied to the language of judgment. So Ezekiel 38:22 says, I will execute judgment on him with plague and bloodshed. I will pour down torrents of rain, hailstones, and burning sulfur on him and on his troops and on many nations with him. So Psalm 18 says, out of the brightness of his presence, clouds advanced with hailstones and bolts of lightning. So they saw the way God had judged, the types of ways that God had brought judgment in the Old Testament, him raining down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah, the literal plagues on Egypt. They took these literal phenomenon and they became metaphors and symbols for judgment. And again, the hailstones here in the book of Revelation is a symbol for judgment. But there is also a literal sense to this as well, because if you imagine yourself in Jerusalem in the first century and 45-kilogram hailstones, that's the image that's being pictured here, or 100 pounds. Now, interestingly, Josephus describes, when he talks about the judgment which came upon Jerusalem, he talks about how Rome catapulted these massive stones, these massive boulders into Jerusalem when it came as part of their war tactics. This is how they destroyed sections of the wall. They catapulted these huge boulders into the city. So although the book of Revelation is speaking metaphorically and poetically here, there's also a realism to it, that these hailstones are symbolic of the catapults, that the boulders that Rome throws and hurls into the city as it's bringing about its judgment. This is how Rome took the city. It catapulted these large stones, and those who were guarding the walls had to flee because the sections of the wall are being destroyed by these heavy boulders. And what does that allow the Roman Empire to do? It allows them then to build a siege ramp and to then enter into the city, having scattered those who are guarding the city. So we can see that this metaphorical imagery does have a literalism to it as well. But are there any questions or comments there? Excellent, friends. So that completes our examination of Revelation chapter 16. That completes our examination of the 7 bowls of wrath. Next week, when we start to look at Revelation chapter 17, we will see that Revelation 17 now begins a new scene in the book of Revelation. There's a shift now in the book of Revelation. But that concludes our examination now of this particular scene. But what I want to do now is I want to spend some time talking about, in the 30 minutes that we have remaining, I want to talk about Jesus's teachings on the end times. Now, we're not going to go into any exhaustive analysis of what Jesus has to say because it would take too long. But there are some clever things that Jesus says, which I think now that we've come this far in the book of Revelation, we can appreciate and we can understand things that Jesus has said better. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to zero in on a very important question that people often have when it comes to end times theology. And that is, as followers of Jesus, we live in this world where we know, as the book of Revelation 11:15 says, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. Now, we know that Jesus reigns, but we don't yet see the full outworking of the reign of Christ in our day and age. We still see a world which is in rebellion to God. So how, as the people of God, how do we understand, how do we apply the sorts of things that Jesus said about the end times? How do we apply it today, knowing that the end times hasn't yet reached its fulfillment? Jesus hasn't yet returned to earth. Okay, so what I want to say is our analysis of the first century culture actually helps us to understand Jesus' teaching on the end times. In fact, understanding some of the clever images Jesus uses when he talks about the end times will actually help us gain a better appreciation for what the end times means for us today and how we should apply the things Jesus had to say about the end times. So throughout the Gospels, this is obvious. Anybody who's read the Gospels would have picked up on this really quickly. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus alludes to the end times on several occasions. And he uses illustrations familiar to his audience. And if we understand the first century culture and we understand those illustrations and how the first century world would have unpacked the illustrations that Jesus used, it helps us actually understand what Jesus has to say about the end times. So our understanding of the teachings of Jesus and the way in which Jesus uses rhetorical metaphors, if we understand the metaphors Jesus uses, it will sharpen our theology of the end times. So basically, friends, what I'm trying to say is, if we understand the metaphors, the first century metaphors that Jesus used, the cultural metaphors he used, if we can understand them and appreciate them as his first audience did, our theology around the end times will be a lot sharper. And this is something that if I said to somebody, before you read the book of Revelation, read what Jesus has to say first about the end times. Read and appreciate the clever metaphors he uses, because if you can understand that, your theology on the end times will be sharper. Does it make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
If anything, there's a reason why I waited till this long to bring this up. But if anything, before we read the book of Revelation, we should always read what Jesus has to say about the end times. Because when we sharpen our theological armor, when we sharpen our theological brain, it makes studying the book of Revelation a lot clearer. So in fact, understanding Jesus' teachings on the subject of end times is actually more pivotal than anything else. It's more pivotal than understanding the book of Revelation. And the first thing that Jesus teaches us, and Jesus never deviates away from this position, the date of his return is none of our business. He says clearly, but about that day or the hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. His disciples, after his resurrection in the book of Acts, his disciples asked him, hey, Jesus, when are you going to restore the kingdom? When are you going to come and rule forever and ever? And what does Jesus say? He says to them, mind your business. It is not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority. What's your job? Verse 8, your job is to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So that's, Jesus never deviates from that. So the book of Revelation doesn't give us any more of a window into when the end times are going to be. And when people today, they spend more time dissecting Middle Eastern politics than actually reading Jesus's words and trying to understand and trying to meditate on Jesus's words. Have you found that? I'm not sure if you've realized, but prior to the book of Revelation, this is why I said that. I clarified this before we unpack the book of Revelation, that our primary focus is not on what modern people are saying about end times theology with reference to Middle Eastern politics today, or with what happens in the Bible Belt of American Christianity. The Bible Belt of American Christianity, brothers and sisters, has done a lot of damage. It's set us back in many ways in trying to understand end times theology, because instead of unpacking the Bible, it unpacks modern politics, and that is dangerous. So in our analysis, in our unpacking of the book of Revelation, brothers and sisters, I ask you, have we ever spent any time trying to speculate as to when Jesus is going to return? Have we ever said, oh, look, I think he could return next year? I mean, maybe the time is now. Friends, we haven't.
No, we haven't.
We've studied the Bible as it was meant to be studied, not with our speculation. And that is the first marker that we've got to understand when it comes to Jesus' teachings. He doesn't want us to know because it's not important to our mission. Our mission is to preach the gospel. It isn't to tell everyone, oh, he's going to return tomorrow. Any questions or comments with that first very important point? So the first illustration, the first metaphor which Jesus uses is the metaphor of marriage when it comes to his teaching on the end times. Now, there's another analogy which Jesus uses a lot in his preaching, and that's the analogy of the farming analogy, the harvest analogy. The farmer goes out, he sows a seed. We see that analogy used time and time again. And if you think back, we're going a couple of months back now, but remember when we looked at the chapter 14, Revelation 14, when it talked about the great harvest? And we spent some time talking about how the harvest metaphor or the farming illustration is used in some of Jesus' parables and in some of the teachings of the New Testament. Well, by far and away, the two analogies Jesus uses the most in his teaching is the farming analogy, because these are farming communities, but the illustration, the marriage illustration, because we are the bride of Christ. So if we unpack the marriage metaphor, and if we understand how the earliest hearers of Jesus's words and his teachings were interpreting the marriage illustration that Jesus was using, then it'll help us actually understand probably the two most important end times principles the end times questions that people have. So there's two things about the end times which you and I try to keep in sync here. Number one is this truth that the date of Jesus' return is unknowable. We don't know the date that Jesus is going to return. And it comes back to that passage we just looked at. No one knows, only the Father knows. So we don't know the day of Jesus' return. That's the first big principle when it comes to end times theology. But the second principle is that even though we don't know the day, we are called to keep watch. We're called to be attentive to the signs that Christ's return is coming near. Jesus says in Matthew 24, therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will not come at an hour when you do not expect him. So think about these two very important themes. How is it that Jesus says to us, I'm not going to tell you when I'm going to return. I'm not going to tell you the date or the time period. But at the same time, I want you to be vigilant. So how do we keep these two threads? How do we stitch them together? It's like a seesaw going up and down. How do we keep these two pillars together? Well, the marriage illustration actually helps us keep these two things in concert. Because what happens, right, is Jesus, when he talks about the end times, he keeps going back to the marriage illustration. And brothers and sisters, if we understand the marriage illustration, then actually these two things which are almost contrasting actually come together. They come together. Let me explain. Imagine yourself in the first century world. A bride and a groom get engaged. What happens? It isn't like today where they send out invitations saying, come to this venue at this day and this time, and that's when the wedding is going to take place. No. When a couple were betrothed, when a couple were engaged, what happens? The man goes away and he starts to make preparations. He starts to make preparations to his father's house. Remember, in my father's house are many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I'm going to come back to take you to be with me, so that where I am, you may be there also. His disciples would have picked up on this straight away. Why? Because they live in a culture where men, when they get engaged to their bride, what do? They go back to their father's land and they make preparations. If he's in an urban environment, his father gives him a plot of land and he builds a house there. Once the house is built, he goes back and he takes his bride and he brings her back to his house. If he's in an urban area, what do his fathers do? They get a carpenter, they get a contractor, they get tradesmen to build an extra level to the house. When the house is completed, what happens? The bridegroom goes back and gets his bride. So you think about this, right? In Jesus' day, there's no refrigeration, right? So if you're in a village and you know that a wedding is coming up any day now, what do? You watch. You watch. Has the bridegroom completed the house on that plot of land? Has that extra level been built? Remember, when Joseph is betrothed to Mary, what is Mary doing? She's waiting for Joseph to complete the house. So what are the villagers doing? They're watching. They're watching to see, when is the bridegroom going to come? And meanwhile, what is the bride doing? She's getting her dress ready. The bridesmaid's getting ready. Where they're starting to see word on the street, well, he's almost done. He's almost built. Any day now, he's going to start. You're going to hear the wedding feast begin. You're going to hear all of these sorts of things. What are you doing? You're watching, you're watching, you're watching. Weddings don't last for one day as they do today. In Jesus' day, they last for 7 days. Why? Because people are coming from different villages. What happens? Oh, the wedding is begun. Let's go get so-and-so from the other village. He's going to arrive. Remember in the story of Jesus changing water into wine, on the third day, run out of alcohol. Why do weddings last so long? Because unlike today, when there's a fixed date and you come on that fixed date, you go to the wedding, you go to the reception. No, in Jesus' day, nobody knows. It can be at any time. So as soon, if you're in a nearby village and you get word, hey, the wedding has started, what do? You race to be part of the wedding, and you might get there on day 2, day 3, but you make sure you get there. So what is Jesus saying to his audience when he uses this marriage illustration with connection to the end times? He's like, you watch, you be prepared. Just like a bride is getting ready, just like the bridesmaids are getting ready, just like the villagers are getting the meals ready and all of these sorts of things ready. There's no refrigeration. You got to get the food ready. The food's got to be fresh. You watch that house and you see the house is getting ready. It's getting built. And when you know the house has reached its completion, then any day now, the bridegroom is going to come and collect his bride. So think about this with respect to the end times. What is Jesus saying to us? He's saying, keep watch. Watch at how my house is getting built. Watch at how it's getting built, because once it reaches its completion, once the fullness of the Gentiles reaches its full measure, then I will return. Now, back to Brady's very important question. Why does Jesus say, if Jesus is God and he's supposed to be all-knowing, why is it that Jesus doesn't know the day or the hour? Only the Father knows. There is a very important cultural element to the narrative which Jesus' audience would have understood. The bridegroom, the groom, right, is with his father. He's in his father's household. He's making preparations to the room, right? In Jesus' culture, the father would have the privilege of publicly saying to the son, my son, now everything is completed. Go and get your bride. Go and get your bride. Now, you think about it from the son's point of view, right? The son is working with the father to make the building, to complete the house. So, of course, the son knows when the building is complete. He's doing the work. The Spirit of God is doing the work. But in Jesus' day, sons would not usurp their father's authority. No son would come out and say, all right, fellas, now's the time for me to get my bride. No. he would give his father the honor of saying to the public, now is the time for the wedding. So what Jesus was saying to his audience is, he's not saying, I don't know when the end times is or when the end dates are. Jesus is God, of course he knows. What's he saying to his disciples? He's saying to his disciples, I'm going to give my father the respect and the esteem that he deserves by allowing him to declare and say, now is the time. Jesus, go and get your bride. Yeah, so this is a point that people have taken. They've said, well, in his human state, maybe he has surrendered the knowledge of the end times, and I believe that that's a possible interpretation. But I actually think that theologically, there's a lot of things Jesus does have access to. He knows, he predicts the destruction of the temple. So why is it that my question would be, why is it that he has access to some elements of divine foreknowledge, but there are other parts he doesn't? And my thinking is more so that his audience would have understood that he's using an analogy, and then in the analogy, he's not saying that he doesn't know the day or the hour, or that he doesn't possess that knowledge. It's rather that he's saying to his audience, actually, it is the Father's prerogative to inaugurate the end times. So I'm not going to usurp my Father's authority. I'm going to give that esteem to my Father. So I want to now point out how this marriage illustration is used in another parable which Jesus uses. It's the famous parable of the 10 virgins. Could somebody read that parable for us? It is in Matthew 25, verses 1 to 13. I've got it up there on screen, so you can either read it from your Bible or you can read it on the screen there. Somebody want to read that for us?
At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come to meet him." Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed the lamps. The foolish one said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the others also came. "Lord, Lord," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "Truly, I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour."
Yeah, again, so Jesus uses that marriage metaphor, that marriage illustration here to give a lesson about the end times. And again, it was an illustration that his audience would have understood well. It would be like me giving an illustration about a bride walking down the aisle, and I would say, well, first the bridesmaids walk down first, then the bride follows and walks in down. His audience would have understood exactly what he was talking about here. So in Jesus' context, as I mentioned, weddings didn't last one day. They lasted a whole week. People were coming from village to village doing things. And there were different festivals which made up the end times. So, sorry, the wedding banquet. So what typically would happen is when the father says, "Yep, son, now is the time to go get your bride," the bride would begin a period of dancing and celebrating with her bridesmaids. Then what would happen is when the bridesmaids, the groom would come and collect the bridesmaids. And because weddings lasted 7 days, the bridegroom could come at any time and collect the bridesmaids. And there were parts of the wedding week, parts of the celebration which took place particularly at nighttime. So obviously at nighttime you need to be able to see. So they would have these lamps, and they would burn these lamps, and they would need to have a constant replenishing of oil, because oil burns actually really, really quickly. A wedding a bridesmaid, and to be a bridesmaid was an immense honor in Jesus' day. It was an immense honor. If a woman asked you to be a bridesmaid, it was an immense honor. So the wedding festival went for days, and some parts of the celebrations and the festivities took place at night. So if a bridesmaid did not take enough oil with her, and she ran out of oil, and she had to go in the middle of the night to collect more oil, and in the interim, the groom comes to collect the bridesmaids, to take them to participate in the important part of the celebration and all the dancing and stuff like that, she would miss out. So what Jesus is saying to his audience here is that you have to keep watch. You've always got to be prepared. You always have to be playing the part of the bridesmaids accurately and not running out. Because if you do and I return, what happens then? If the groom comes to collect you and you're off somewhere else, well, you would miss out. And in Jesus' day, if the groom came to collect the bridesmaids for the celebration and they were not prepared, it was a dishonor and it was culturally reprehensible. So what would the groom do? He wouldn't stand around waiting for them to return. No, they would be left and he would go off and he would take those who were there. So that knowledge here of first century wedding practices helps us appreciate what Jesus is saying and the importance of keeping watch and always living in a state of preparedness, watching for signs that the groom is going to return. But let's now continue now with another analogy Jesus uses, the parable of the wedding banquet, which is in Matthew 22. It says, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent some more servants and said, tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. Come to the wedding banquet. And I've summarized. That's 14 verses there, which I've summarized. Now, again, how would Jesus' audience have understood this? They would have picked up the analogy straight away. That in Jesus' day, if a rich king or if a rich landowner had a wedding, what would he do? He would typically invite everyone. He would invite people from his village. He would invite people from the surrounding villages. And think about it, if a famous king in Jesus' day gave you the honor of coming to his wedding, you wouldn't turn that invitation down. You would respond to that invitation. You would come gladly and you would accept that invitation. Now, typically in Jesus' day, there was attire you had to wear. And if you read that particular parable, you'll realize that one of the subjects is cast out because he's not wearing the correct attire. Now, in Jesus' day, if you went to a wedding, you had to wear certain attire. Otherwise, what? You would be cast out, right? So what is Jesus again saying in this analogy? He's saying that there's going to be a great heavenly banquet one day, and only those who are clothed in the garments of white, who are clothed in righteousness, who are clothed in the righteousness of Christ, will actually have a seat at the great banquet. But all others who don't heed the invitation of the king, what will happen? They will be cast out. So what is Jesus saying? Well, just like a king or a ruler sends out invitations and he freely invites people to the wedding banquet, the great wedding banquet in heaven is one in which everybody is invited. God has given the invitation for everybody to come, but not everybody is going to accept the invitation. Now imagine if you were in another village and a great king invited you to his wedding or to the wedding of his son and you didn't come. That was reprehensible. And you fell under the curse of that particular leader. You know, it wasn't one of those things today where if you can't make it to a wedding, what happens? People excuse you, you get pardoned, right? Oh, I forgive you, I understand. No. If you were invited to a wedding in those days and you didn't show up, that was reprehensible. That was that was scandalous in Jesus's day. So the same thing Jesus is saying is that if you are invited to the greatest wedding banquet of all time, the banquet of Christ marrying his bride, the banquet in heaven, and you don't show up, that is reprehensible. Is this starting to make sense to everyone? Is it starting to fall into place? The final analogy which I want to use that Jesus talks about is the illustration of economic management. Jesus uses illustrations of economics to actually communicate the point. And one famous analogy he uses, one famous parable he tells, you know the parable, it's the parable of the talents or the bags of gold, which take place in Matthew 25, verses 14 to 28. We're running out of time, so we won't read it, right? But what does it say in this parable? It says, again, it'll be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them, right? So you know in the story, he gives different bags of gold, different talents to different people, and two of them invest the talents, one of them doesn't. And eventually, after a long time, the master returns, right? Well, this was a common circumstance in Jesus' day. Wealthy landowners would entrust their wealth into the hands of their trusted servants whilst they went on long journeys, right? Now, it's not like today where there's aeroplanes and the like, where if you're going away to do a big business deal, right? Imagine a businessman, a CEO who goes away to do a business deal. You know when they're going to return, right? They're communicating with you via email. They're communicating with you via phones. You've got their itinerary, their travel itinerary. So you know a CEO goes off overseas, a government official goes overseas, signs an important trade deal. They come back, right? These are short transactions, right? But this wasn't the case in Jesus' day. There's no phones, there's no emails, there's no transportation, there's no cars, all those sorts of things, right? So if a wealthy businessman goes away to another village to do a deal, to do a business deal, he's not always going to come back at the time you expect him to come back, right? The business deal could take days, it could take weeks, who knows when he comes back. So in the interim, the servants are entrusted to do what? To invest and expand the wealth of the master. Again, this is like the kingdom of God. We don't know when Jesus is going to come back. So instead, what are we to do? We're to busy ourselves investing in the kingdom and building in the kingdom, because the master is going to come back from a long, long journey one day when we least expect it. And he's going to call us to give account for how we have invested the talents and the resources that he's given us, right? Does this make sense to everyone? How understanding the first century culture helps us understand how we're to hold these two things in relationship, that we don't know the day or the hour, but we're called to be watchful. We're called to be always working, because we don't know when Jesus is going to return. And just finally, to bring this back full circle, in Matthew 24, Jesus says, "Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household, to give them food at their proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, 'My master is staying away a long time,' and then he begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he is not aware of, and he will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Now, again, think about that analogy which we've just said. Think about a master who wants to go away and do a business deal. He entrusts his most reliable servant to look after the other servants, like to be the manager of the household while he's gone. And the master goes away, and for weeks and months and maybe even years, he's away doing his business deals. So what happens? The chief servant sees, my master is away a long time. So what does he start to do? he starts to misappropriate the master's resources. He starts to beat, he starts to mistreat the other servants. And one day what happens? The master returns and finds the chief servant doing dodgy deals, mistreating, and not using his wealth appropriate. So what does he do? He casts him out of the kingdom. And what is Jesus saying to us? What's the main point? Is he saying those servants whom he's entrusted to expand his kingdom are who? You and I. We are the servants whom he has put in charge of expanding his kingdom. Now, if we sit back and we think, you know what? Jesus is a long time coming. He has not returned yet. What do? We start to abuse the other servants. We start to not use our talents appropriately because we think Jesus is long in coming. What are we waiting for? Well, eventually he's going to come and he's going to see us not using our gifts and talents appropriately. So what happens? He will cast us out with the hypocrites. And what did he say? He said to his people, he said, "Depart from me, I never knew you." Depart from me. So understanding the stories Jesus tells and the images and the metaphors that he uses, the illustrations he uses, and how the first century audience would have understood these helps us understand end times theology, and it sharpens our end times theology and our understanding of what Jesus had to say about the end times.